Hello everybody, it's me, the Friendly Englishman. Thank you so much for joining me for part 6 of Seer by C.L. Werner. This is the start of chapter 5, Knives in the Dark. The lair of Seer Thrakri was a resplendent, vault-like hall buried deep beneath under Altdorf's temple of the Horned Rat. Thick walls of stone reinforced with bars of steel ensured that even the largest burrower, bred by the diseased fleshed shapers of Clan Moulder, would not be able to penetrate the Skaven priest sanctuary. The flagstones upon the floor were massive blocks of granite plundered from the sewers and cellars of the human city above. Green light flickered from warpstone lanterns set high into the ceiling, crafted from the mangled remains of chandeliers and candelabra. Mouldering rugs and tapestries, their colours faded by Skaven excretions, their finery frayed and tattered by the gnawing of rats, covered much of the floor. At the centre of the hall, a monstrous heap of soiled pillows rose, heavy with the stink of ratkin musk. In a shocking display of wealth, decadence and power, the heap of pillows was occupied by a pair of immense, bloated masses of fur and rat. The swollen bulks of a pair of Skaven females, the nearly mindless broodmothers of the ratkin. Steel collars circled their swollen necks, thick chains fixing the huge creatures to metal rings set into the floor. Thankwall was unable to decide what he should feel as he stalked into the hall. Envy, fear, or disgust. He settled on a mix of the three. Thrakri was clearly trying to impress his guest with this show of opulence and power, yet Thankwall could not help but see in the elder Seer's lair a vivid display of the priest's own decadence and corruption. Like the rest of under Altdorf, Thrakri had pretensions of grandeur, imagining himself some manner of petty Seer Lord. For someone who had only recently grovelled before Kritislik, there was something shabby, laughable in such a display. An emasculated human slave rose from a small kennel at the side of the hall and approached as Thankwall entered the chamber. The temple guards who had conducted him through the temple into Thrakri's sanctum withdrew, casting a few jealous looks over their shoulders as they stalked back up the stairs. His own storm vermin, the matched set of albino mutes from Skaven Blight, had been left in the temple, but Thankwall's persistence had forced the temple adepts to allow him to bring Cratch at least to this private audience. It was comforting to know he had at least one underling to throw between himself and any treachery Thrakri might be plotting. The slave bowed before Thankwall, making the gesture a strange hybrid of human and Skaven, by twisting his head to expose his throat to the Seer. Thankwall paid scant notice to the wretch, instead sniffing at the platter of delicacies he carried. An array of cheeses and sweetmeats teased his senses, setting his stomach growling. Whatever his other thoughts, Thrakri had certainly cultivated an expensive taste for human cuisine. Thankwall started to reach for the platter, then his paw froze. Thoughts of treachery reasserting themselves, he glowered at Cratch, nudging the apprentice forwards. The young adept hesitated, twitching nervously as he felt Thankwall's impatience grow. With a shivering paw, Cratch timidly retrieved a wedge of cheese from the platter. Thankwall continued to watch him as the apprentice took slight, dainty nibbles of the food. "Seer Thankwall," the voice of Thrakri rose from the midst of the pillow nest. The elder Seer appeared from the mass of feathers and lace, eyes glazed with the effects of warp dust and human liquors. Thrakri had made no effort to disguise the smell of his vices, something that made Thankwall decide the old villain was far less impaired by them than he would like his guest to believe. "I am humbled honoured that so terrible and magnificent a visitor should grace my meagre nest." Thankwall's tail twitched with annoyance. After visiting the other members of Under Altdorf's ruling council for private audiences, even his own ego had grown weary of empty flattery and hollow praise. Again, the Grey Seer's eyes prowled across the walls, looking for any sign of secret doors or hidden guards. The old Skaven nestled among the pillows, chittering with a peal of manic laughter. No, my friend, there is no trick trap. I have all the protection I need right here." Thrakri's paws reached out to either side of him, patting the furry flanks of the broodmothers. At his touch, the swollen females reared up like living pillars, their whiskers brushing the ceiling. Thanquol could see that they had mistaken for layers of fat were in fact knots of muscle. Thrakri's consorts were built more like rat ogres than proper females. Some sick adjustment to their diet perhaps, or some perverse misuse of his magic. But whatever the cause, the feral ferocity smouldering in the eyes of the breeders was enough to chill any would-be assassin. After a moment, the broodmothers subsided, flopping lazily down beside their master once more. Thanquol calmed his pulse and recovered the paces he had retreated when the females had reared. He could appreciate what fine guardians such monsters would make. No Skaven would find anything menacing in the scent of a female. The worst traps were those that did not need to be hidden. But why had Thrakri deigned to disclose this secret? "A gesture of trust," Thrakri answered the unspoken question. "We are both disciples of the Horned Rat. We must have trust in ourselves." Thanquol looked aside at Cratch. The apprentice was showing no sign of poisoning and was attacking a second wedge of cheese with anything but his earlier timidity. Thanquol brought the edge of his staff smacking into Cratch's snout, knocking the young adept back. Seizing one of the sweetmeats for himself, the Grey Seer made a bold spectacle of himself as he approached the nest of Thrakri. "There are suspicion stories in Skaven Blight," Thanquol said between mouthfuls of food. The human slave struggled to keep pace with the advancing Grey Seer. "The Lords of Decay doubt the loyalty of Under Altdorf. Some would squeak that the Lords of Decay lack vision," Thrakri replied in a scratchy whisper. It was a shockingly rebellious comment to make, especially to one who had been sent as a representative of the council. Was the remark a sign of Thrakri's opinion of his own power and position, or was it a mark of the old Skaven's madness? "Perhaps Skaven Blight should step aside and allow those with vision to guide our people," Thrakri continued, his words whispering into the stunned silence. "They talk of destroying the humans, endless plots to conquer and despoil. Why? Why bother to seize with fang and claw what can be so easily taken with craft and cunning? Why conquer when we can rule from the shadows? The humans make so much for us already, never bothering to discover what happens to all that we steal and seize. Why would we wish to jeopardize everything they give us without even knowing?" "Some would say, Squeak, that such words are heresy," Thanquol warned, his claws tightening about the heft of his staff. "It is the destiny of the Skaven to inherit the world of men. This is the sacred promise of the Horned Rat." Thrakri chittered his laughter once more. "The best slaves are those who do not know they are slaves. Look at Under Altdorf. This city has grown to be the most powerful in all the Under Empire, except for Skaven Blight itself, of course. It has prospered so not by fighting the humans, but by using them, growing fat off their labor and industry. The Horned Rat favors cunning, favors those with vision, such as me, and you, Grey Seer Thanquol." Thanquol brushed his teeth together, hearing his name associated with the deranged vision of Thrakwi. If the council had any spies listening, his life would not be worth a waterlogged mouse when he returned to Skaven Blight. The Grey Seer lifted his snout, trying to assert his lack of subservience to the corrupt heretic lounging on the pillows. I am a loyal servant of the council and the Horned Rat, Thankwell began, his words sharp as knives. If the council did have any spies listening, such a display might save his skin when he returned to Skaven Blight. Do you understand what it is they have sent you to find, Grey Seer? Thrakwi interrupted. The question took Thankwell off his guard. He blinked at the old priest, waiting for him to continue. Instead, Thrakwi pointed a shriveled claw at Cratch. Tell him what it is Skarbrit thought to find, Thrakwi ordered. Tell him more than you told those fools in Skaven Blight, he added, with a display of his fangs. Cratch's body was trembling as he felt the eyes of both Grey Seers fastened upon him. He scratched anxiously at his pelt, his glands dripping scent into the rug beneath his feet. It was almost on his tongue to deny Thrakwi's assertion, but a look at the massive shapes of the Grey Seer's consorts and their immense fangs made the adept reconsider. I would have told Old when it was safe alone, Cratch began, apologizing to Thankwell. His tone became more wheedling and his posture lower to the floor when he saw the disbelief in Thankwell's eyes. I didn't want anyone to cheat steal from your glory. Most omnipotent of despots, most ravenous of killers, most... Thankwell swatted Cratch's muzzle with the end of his staff, almost knocking the fawning apprentice from his feet. Say Squeak something interesting, he warned. Skarbrit, the wormstone. Cratch winced as he saw Thankwell start to rise his staff again. It is a weapon. Thankwell bared his fangs in a threatening smile. I already know that, he snapped. You don't know what kind type of weapon, protested Cratch, holding up his paws to protect his snout. Clan pestilence make bring to use against under Altdorf, not manling Altdorf. Thankwell looked from Cratch to the seated Thrakwi. The old Skaven was almost smirking among his nest of pillows. Skarbrit tunneled deep in the archives of under Altdorf to learn of the Wormstone, and I find his trail, Thrakwi explained. He learned of Clan Maul and its fate. How Clan Maul entered into alliance with Clan Pestilence during the Second Plague War and was given the Wormstone as tribute for their loyalty to the Plague Lords. But it was not a gift, Cratch said. It was death that Nurglitch gave to Clan Maul. The Wormstone's power infected the clan, destroying it from the lowliest whelp to the most powerful warlord. Before the infection could spread to the rest of Under Altdorf, the other clans banded together and collapsed all the entrances to Maul Burrows before any of them could escape. Thankwell leaned against his staff, digesting the account. He could well understand why the council had kept this from him. It was one thing to send him after a weapon that would be used against the humans. It was quite another to trust him with a weapon that could decimate an entire clan. You understand, the possibilities? Thrakwi asked. The power of the Wormstone can make us masters of Skavendom. Every stronghold in the Under Empire will tremble before the one who holds the Wormstone. Even the Council will bow to such a menace. We shall cast down the Lords of Decay, replace them with the sort of easily manipulated fools I have contrived to seat upon the Council of Under Altdorf. With the power of the Wormstone, I can make myself Seer Lord, and you, Grey Seer Thankwell, shall be my most exalted and trusted lieutenant, the claw of a new council of 13. Thankwell's tail twitched as he listened to the old Skaven spout his mad ambitions. The insane scheming of a mind grown full with corruption and intrigue. The hidden lord of Under Altdorf, now Thrakri, dared to reach even higher. Thanquol wondered just how deeply Skarbrit had been entangled in the old rat's plotting. Clearly, Thrakri expected to use Thanquol to succeed where his predecessor had failed. The thought brought a flash of scorn rushing through Thanquol's brain. Perhaps Thrakri was right. Perhaps the Wormstone was powerful enough to do everything he said. But as he looked at the bleary-eyed Skaven nestled among his pillows, Thanquol knew that if there was a new Seer Lord, it would not be the High Priest of Under Altdorf. Professor Adelstein sat at his desk, a black feathered quill fairly racing across a brown piece of parchment. This part of the university was deserted this hour, and only the scratching of his pen against the sheet disturbed the eerie silence that filled the darkened building. Beads of sweat dripped from the professor's brow, his breathing short and sharp. It was not merely the grisly nature of what he was committing to the parchment that caused him such distress, though the ghastly carcass of the hound had been horrible enough. It was the strange quill and the thin, smelly ink he employed to write his report that preyed upon Professor Adelstein's mind. No clean thing, this pen and ink, but the stuff of sorcery and darkness. He lifted his eyes from the page to stare again at the macabre inkblot, a thing seemingly crafted from a piece of frozen fire, glowing with an unclean light in the back of his office. However many reports he was called upon to write with the strange ink contained in the weird vessel, the pot never went dry. The fact was the least of his unearthly qualities, however. Looking back at the page, he could see the words he had written writhing and slithering like a nest of serpents, rearranging themselves into new and unfathomable things. They would remain that way, Adelstein knew, until a certain word was spoken above the parchment and the words reformed from the squirming mess of lines and splotches. Adelstein had received the quill and ink pot not long ago, under circumstances he did not care to ponder in the dark hours of the night. He had received many messages written by another who possessed the same sinister ink. A word, a whispered sibilant, that was more like the rasp of a jungle snake than anything related to a human tongue. This would unlock the orders that came to Adelstein from his hidden master. Such a message had led to his examination of the dog carcass. Lenny Clyfoth, he knew, had received a similar message. Neither knew that they were expected to find, or what the importance of their examination was. They did not need to understand. It was enough that they obeyed. The quill stopped moving as Adelstein hastily completed his report. He watched as the last words he had written slithered into a meaningless jumble, then tightly rolled the pages together, tying a string about the bundle. The professor was breathing even more heavily as he walked across his darkened office, navigating between tables strewn with books and shelves groaning beneath the weight of pickled specimens in glass jars. He pushed a chair against the wall, climbing up onto its seat. Adelstein stretched his hand above him, pushing open the window set high in the wall. He stretched his hand further to the opening, holding the roll of parchment through the open window. Since the message had reached him, Adelstein knew his office was being watched. Somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting for his report. The distinct, pungent smell of the ink reached out to it, carrying to it even through the fog of Altdorf's night. Adelstein felt something cold briefly brush against his hand, scales brushing against his flesh. The parchment was tugged from his fingers by a firm, powerful grip. Faintly, Adelstein could hear something flutter into the night. He hurriedly closed the window again and dropped down from the chair. Adelstein stepped to one of the specimen shelves and reached behind a pickled pig fetus to retrieve a hidden bottle of schnapps. The professor took a quick pull from the bottle, feeling a warm flush pulse through his quivering body. Adelstein had tried to see what retrieved his reports once, when he had not known better. Scaly and hideous, he had been careful never to look at the strange courier again. There were books in the university with illustrations of the fauna of distant Lustria. What he had seen was not unlike the Lustrian lizard bat, but there was none of the scholarly detachment of looking at an illustration in an old book when he saw one such thing fluttering outside his window in the dead of the night. The professor shuddered and took another drink. The creature was frightening enough, but his memory was clear enough to know it was nothing beside the master it served, the same whom Adelstein himself obeyed. Grey Seer Thanquol took up the position of honour well to the rear of the mass of Skaven who stalked through the dripping sewers of Altdorf. It was a motley gathering of warriors and specialists bestowed upon him by the clans of Under Altdorf. Sword rats from the warlord clans, scouts from Clan Eschen and Clan Skoll, sharpshooters and globadiers from Clan Scryer, and green-garbed monks from Clan Pestilence. At the head of the procession, flanked by hulking warriors twisted by unnameable experiments, one of Clan Moulder's Beastmasters led the way, a pale, twisted thing hopping through the sludge ahead of him. The Beastmaster's charge was a warp bat, weird denizen of the underworld's deepest caverns and tunnels, a massive, flightless bat with an uncanny facility for sniffing out concentrations of warpstone. The creatures were the most prized possessions of Skaven miners, and convincing Clan Moulder to lend the animal to Thanquol's expedition had involved making promises even the Grey Seer's lying tongue hesitated to agree to. The alternative, of course, would have been to trust Cratch to lead the way, but Thanquol's distrust of his apprentice had grown by leaps and bounds following his meeting with Thrakwi. It was better to limit his dependence on the adept as much as possible. The fate of Scarbrit remained foremost in Thanquol's mind as they navigated the network of brick-walled tunnels and slimy canals. He tried to watch Cratch from the corner of his eye, and made certain that his white storm vermin were positioned securely behind him. Their presence would discourage any thoughts of putting a knife in his back. Cratch, of course, wasn't the only enemy he had to worry about. It had taken a fair degree of coercion and manipulation of Under Altdorf's ruling clans to gain the support he needed for his expedition. Any one of the city's scheming councillors might be plotting treachery to seize the prize Thanquol was looking for. If Thrakwi felt safe enough to be so indiscreet about his loyalty to Skavenblight, strange ideas might have sifted down to the clan leaders themselves. Warp Lord Quillisk, in particular, was being quite heavy-pawed in his dealings with the Grey Seer. He had sent one of his subordinate councillors, Fiskit Burnfang, to assist Thanquol. The number of representatives Clan Scryer sent along was also a bit more than Thanquol had asked for. Somehow, he doubted the fact was intended to benefit him. At least it set the representatives and warriors of the other clans on their guard. They would be too busy watching the Scryer Ratkin for the first sniff of betrayal to think about moving against Thanquol himself. Down through the murk of the sewers, the pack of Skaven plodded. The stink of human filth was everywhere, the sounds of their feet and wagons filtering down from the streets above. Thanquol felt his contempt for the surface dwellers swell, furless, undisciplined vermin, arrogantly thinking themselves masters of the earth. They would be forced to remember who the real masters were. Too many times had their kind stood between the Skaven race and its destiny. Too many times they had defied the prophecy of the Horned Rat. Too many times had they thwarted the ambitions of Thanquol the Mighty. Thrakwi was wrong. Destruction of the humans was the most sacred duty any Skaven could aspire to, and Thanquol would be that Skaven. The Beastmaster at the head of the pack cried out, a sharp squeak of warning and excitement. Thanquol snapped orders to the storm vermin behind him, inciting them to lift him above the thrall. Planting his feet in their strong paws, Thanquol peered over the heads of his minions. He could see a jagged patch of raw earth where the human brickwork had been pulled away. The telltale marks of Skaven claws and fangs pitted the damp earth, vanishing into the blackness of a tunnel. The Beastmaster stood before the opening, the pallid warp bat straining at its leash in its eagerness to dash into the gloom. "Find search, quick, quick!" Thanquol snapped, slapping the muzzles of the storm vermin to encourage them to lower him. The motley pack of Skaven milled about uncertainly for a moment, but their own leaders began to echo Thanquol's order. Cautiously, but with speed, the Skaven began to converge on the earthen tunnel. Thanquol let the mass of ratkin plunge ahead, lingering behind as was the right of any wise leader. He waited until only himself and his immediate entourage was still standing in the sewer, then turned on Cratch. "Tell me again how Skarbrit died," Thanquol hissed. His claws slowly tapped on the sword dangling from his rat gut belt. "In case you forgot anything the first time you told it." Cratch ground his teeth together nervously, only managing to make eye contact with Thanquol by the most severe of efforts. "Wait, a terrible scourger of the man-spawn. I have told said it all. Unlucky Skarbrit was crushed when the cave collapsed upon him." "But Cratch was luckier," Thanquol stated, displaying his fangs. He gestured with the head of his staff, pointing at the tunnel. "You first, most loyal and eager apprentice. That way, if anything happens to me, it happens to you first." Cratch gave a backward look at the sewer behind him, looking for a moment as though he might flee. Wiser impulses prevailed, however. Still grinding his teeth nervously, Cratch slowly made his way into the tunnel, feeling Thanquol's eyes glued to his every step. The Grey Seer took no reassurance from Cratch's reluctance. He hesitated as he watched Cratch vanish into the darkness, then gestured to his storm vermin. "Follow him," Thanquol told the Albinos. "Watch him. Watch everything." He dug the little box of warpstone snuff from his robes and inhaled a pinch of the gritty dust, feeling its sorcerous energy sear through his body, firing his senses and stealing his courage. "I'll be right behind you," he said, pushing his bodyguards forwards. Thanquol gave a last anxious look at the dripping sewers. Briefly, he considered the thought that had occurred to Cratch, but decided against such ignoble retreat. His decision was helped somewhat by the way the shadows seemed to coil about the brickwork, support pillars in menacing patches of darkness. They might hide almost anything, at least. Whatever the dark tunnel might be hiding would have plenty of other Skaven to distract it from himself. Thanquol turned and scurried after his storm vermin, with just enough haste to not undermine his carefully woven air of authority. After the Grey Seer vanished down the tunnel, one patch of shadow detached itself from a nearby pillar. Sheathing his sword, Scarpaw gave a disappointed cough. He should have realized that killing Thanquol would not be so easy. "I'm still worried about him," Johann told his brother. The two smugglers were prowling the narrow streets of the waterfront, trying to keep the back alleys and seldom-travelled lanes that twisted their way between a festering array of hostels and tenements. "You worry too much," Hans chided him. The older Dietrich kicked a broken jar lying in the muddy lane. He grimaced as something that smelt of old cabbages splattered across his boot. He motioned for Johann to wait while he tried to wipe the muck off by rubbing his shoe against the plaster wall beside him. "Gustav Volk is still looking for us," Johann said. "What if he found Kleiner?" Hans abandoned his effort to clean himself. He wrinkled his nose at the revolting brown smear he had made on the wall, then shrugged and jogged to catch up with his brother. If Volk's mob found Kleiner, then they're the ones you should be worrying about. Johann shook his head as they started down another nameless alley. This time Hans was careful to step around a splintered tankard that was in his path. You saw Kleiner when we were in Lowe's, Johann objected. The man could barely stand. I've seen beggars who looked healthier. Most beggars are healthy, Hans scolded. Best racket in the city, as long as you pay your tithe to the priests of Renald. He saw the irritation on Johann's face and changed his attitude. Kleiner probably just drank too much, he assured. You know him. Probably celebrating, selling the Weirdstone before we'd even got a single copper from it. We didn't know it was Weirdstone before we went to Lowe's. Hans let out a disgusted sigh. Mother hen, that's you, dear brother. I didn't see Kempf around this morning, but I don't see you worrying about him. Kempf is so slippery, a rat couldn't keep up with him, said Johann. He can take care of himself. Kleiner can't, Hans protested, his voice incredulous. I've seen the man outdrink a Kossar and outfight a Norskan. He wasn't sick then, Johann said. He hurried to the other side of the alley as a window opened in the wall above and someone emptied a slop bucket into the street. Hans didn't match his brother's agility and soon had a cloak to match his boot. So what if Volk gets him? Hans growled, wringing filth from his clothes. One more share for the rest of us. Johann gave his brother a withering smile. Not if Volk makes him talk first. Hans's face went pale, his eyes going wide with alarm. He grabbed his brother's arm, fairly pulling the big man down the alley. What are we standing around talking for? Let's go check on my friend Kleiner. I want him out! The old woman's shrill voice was as piercing as a lance this close to his ear. Theodore Bayer glared at the crone, but if her vision was still clear enough to note the expression, she took no notice of it. Into the street! She shrieked. I'll not have some pox-ridden vagabond giving my house a poor reputation. The old hag stomped one of her feet against the wormy floorboards of the landing, the thick leather clogs she wore threatening to punch through the dilapidated wood. I will not have people driven away because they can hear I'm harbouring disease in my house. Then maybe you should keep your voice down, Grey Mother, Theodore hissed. The way you are shrieking, they can probably hear you at the Emperor's palace. The landlady's face grew flush with indignation. A little withered specimen of waterfront wretchedness, the crone retreated down the rickety stairs with all the grace of a one-legged cat. Somehow she remained upright throughout her stumbling withdrawal. She turned at the foot of the stairs, pointing a crooked finger at Theodore Bayer and the two watchmen with him. Not another night under this roof, she said, her tone as imperious as anything spoken by the Emperor. You put him out, or I'll speak to your captain. Her threat made the old woman... With her threat made, the old woman scrambled back behind the door of her own rooms and slammed it behind her. What a charming lady, one of the watchmen commented. Is it wrong to hope the goblins come for her? You were the one who heard her screaming for the watch, the other soldier said. If it was left to me, I would have ignored her and kept right on walking. Theodore was still staring down the stairs at the old man's refuge, only absently listening to the conversation of his subordinates. They had spent a long night prowling this district, searching for anything out of the ordinary, and the tempers of all three men were growing short. The tempers of his subordinates would be even shorter if they learned the orders had not come from the captain, but from a strange slip of parchment only Theodore himself had seen. That was something Theodore did not intend to share with his men. There were some things it was better for them to not know about. Still, there was no denying that their long night vigil had failed to produce any results. Whatever had caused the grisly affliction of the dog the night before, they had seen no further evidence of it. Theodore would have dismissed the incident as some one-off monstrosity, some vile mutant that had somehow eluded the attentions of the witch hunters, if it had not been for the orders he had received from his hidden master. As long as he had served the unseen hand, Theodore had never known the master to be wrong. If the message said the dog was not a lone aberration, then Theodore knew not to question. Something one of his men said began to nag at Theodore. He looked back at the soldiers, then at the door behind them on the landing. "We might not have augured the old hag, but something is ignoring us," he said. Walking quickly to the door, the sergeant brought his hand smacking against the panels in his most demanding and official knock. Still, there was no sign of acknowledgement. He waited a moment, pressing his ear to the door, listening for any sound in the room beyond. An uneasy feeling crawled up Theodore's spine. Stepping away from the door, he motioned to his men. "Kick it in," he told them. The two watchmen were quick to comply, hobnailed boots making short work of the worm-eating panels. Theodore squirmed his hand through the splintered wood and threw back the bolt. The smell was the first thing that struck the soldiers as they opened the ruined door. A greasy stench of sickness mixed with a vilely sweet scent. The squalor of the room was made still more foul by the brown, greasy rags strewn about the floor and lying thick upon the straw-covered pallet that had served the occupant as a bed. Pots and buckets of filth were piled all around the bed, abandoned when the inmate had become too weak to tip them out the room's little window. Despite the reek, Theodore was struck by the absence of flies. At this time of year, they should be thick as lice in such surroundings. The sergeant felt the hairs on his arm prickle with uneasiness. There was something wrong, something unholy about this place, something more terrible than disease and plague, something that offended even the most base of insects. Theodore Bayer was a brave man. He had patrolled these same dark streets alone during the height of the beast murders without a thought to his own safety. And yet it took every effort of will for him to approach the pallet. His men lingered behind, steadfastly holding position in the doorway. After taking only a few steps forward towards the pallet, Theodore quickly rejoined them, pushing both soldiers back into the landing and slamming the door behind him. "Fritz," Theodore pointed to one of his men, "you will stay here. No one entered this room. Not the old lady, not another watchman, not even the Grand Theogenist." Theodore stared into the soldier's eyes until he was certain he had impressed upon the man the seriousness of his orders. It was the pale, frightened glaze over the sergeant's features more than his tone of voice that drove home the gravity of the situation. Theodore started down the stairs, taking the other watchman with him. "I am going to make my report to the captain. I will send relief for you as quickly as possible," he called up to the man on the landing as he made a swift exit from the crumbling board house. Already Theodore was pushing the ghastly thing he had seen in the hovel from his mind, concentrating instead upon his next move. He thought about what he would write in his report, considering each word with the utmost care. Words intended for someone much more important and more powerful than his captain. Johann and Hans watched from the blackened mouth in an alleyway as Theodore Bayer and one of his soldiers exited the house. There was no mistaking the intense look on the sergeant's face, nor the haste in his step. "Looks like Bayer found something to nab Kleiner with," Johann commented, smacking fist into palm in a gesture of impotent frustration. Hans sidled nonchalantly against the peeling plaster of the timber-framed wall behind them. "Better than Bayer Volk," the smuggler observed with a shrug. Kleiner can't spend any time in Munston Keep, Johann growled back. Not as sick as he was, it would finish him. The filthy conditions and abysmal deprivations of the prison were infamous among the denizens of Altdorf. For all but the strongest condemned the dungeons of the keep. A sentence of more than a few weeks was as good as a trip to the hangman. We'll get him out, Hans promised. He noted the doubt in his brother's expression. No, seriously. We'll set aside some of the profit from the Weirdstone to bribe the jailers. The way Lowe was preening over the little slice we gave him, there should be more than enough to buy Kleiner's way out. That almost sounds like charity, Hans, Johann said. I guess that's why I don't exactly trust it. Hans spread his hands in a gesture of hurt offence. You wooed me, Johann. Of course I'm not going to leave Kleiner in Munsden. What kind of man do you take me for? Hans hastily continued before his brother could answer that question. Look, it's like this. If Volk had grabbed Kleiner, he might have spilled what he knew to try and swing some sort of deal. But we all know there's no deal you can offer better. Damn Griffin thinks he's in the Reichsguard. Pure as the winter snow, that one. He'd break Kleiner's jaw just for suggesting a payout, and Kleiner knows it. That means he'll keep mum and wait for us to sell the Weirdstone and spring him. You cover all the angles, don't you? Johann scowled. One of us has to, Hans replied with a smile. We can't both of us wear our heart on our sleeve. Johann shook his head and started to back down the alleyway. Hans watched his brother for a moment, then casted a lingering stare at the decaying boarding house. Kleiner, in Bear's hands, would play for some time and would wait for the other smugglers to spring him. Of course, by that stage of the game they would have already sold the Weirdstone. Hans knew his brother wouldn't approve, but Kleiner's capture was something of a windfall. One less share to dole out when the time came to make the split. The smuggler turned and laughed softly as he followed his brother. He wondered how many weeks it would have taken Kleiner to realize that nobody was going to bribe the guards at Munsden Keep. Hans felt little pity for his unfortunate associate. A man who let himself get caught had to look after his own luck. Hans looked back at the house one last time. The smuggler scratched at his neck as he turned away. His skin had been itching all day, growing more persistent and vexing. He'd have to speak with Argula, the Crown and 2 chairmen. He suspected that some of the girls' rooms had bed bugs. The rough earthen tunnels had a fog about them. A thick stink of rotting meat and decaying flesh that set Thankwell's stomach growling and his nerves on edge. The keen nose of a Skaven could easily decipher the smell of their own kind, even in death. There was no horror in the demise of a fellow Ratman, of course. Rare indeed was the Skaven who had not turned to burrow pork as a way of staving off starvation at some stage in his life. Death was death, and meat was meat. What troubled the Grey Seer was not the presence of corpses, but anxious doubts about how they had died, and a nagging suspicion that Kratz was being less than forthcoming about the details of his previous excursion to this forgotten sub-warren of Under Altdorf. Ahead of him, Thankwell could see the shapes of his entourage scurrying down the tunnel, rapidly pursuing Clan Moulder's warp bat. The clan spire element, probably at Viscit Burnfang's command, had produced warpstone lanterns, casting an eerie electrical glow about the throng of Ratmen. It was on Thankwell's tongue to reprimand Burnfang for overstepping his authority and not begging permission of the Grey Seer before illuminating the tunnel. But a sly twitch of his whiskers indicated that Thankwell dismissed the thought as soon as it came to him. Let Burnfang light himself up like a Karak Asgol lava pit. It would make him the most visible and most logical target for anything lurking in the abandoned burrow. The same thought occurred to Kratz. The young adept hesitated in his quick approach to the mob of Skaven, instead creeping back to rejoin Thankwell and his storm vermin. Cratch kept his head low in deference to his master. "Grim tormentor of the unworthy," the apprentice squeaked. "Should you not stop these scryer heretics from displaying their perverse science?" Cratch glanced nervously at the groom around them, his head cocked in a peculiar listening gesture. "Something might see them and do them harm." Thankwell snickered at Cratch's feigned concern. If the apprentice was ever going to amount to more than a snack for the bone chewers, he would need to learn how to lie better. "If Burnfang selflessly offers to present us with warning of any lurking danger, it would be inconsiderate to question his generosity," Thankwell interrupted Cratch's raspy laughter with a cuff across his snout. "Now why not tell your gracious and beneficent mentor what kind of danger you think will spring from the darkness to seize our friend Burnfang?" The Grey Seer's lips pulled back, his fangs gleaming from the darkness. "It wouldn't be the same thing that happened to Scarprit, would it?" Cratch backed away, grinding his fangs together nervously. "Most mighty of magicians, dread sire of warlords and chieftains, it was a simple collapse of these miserable and neglected tunnels that crushed the life from my poor old master." Cratch's nervousness abated, and he warmed to the subject Thankwell had forced from him. "The same fate was almost mine as I tried to save Grey Seer Scarbrit from falling earth. Only by the grace of the Horned Rat was this humble servant to bring word of Scarbrit's discovery to you, great and terrible liege." Thankwell considered cracking Cratch's skull with his staff to stifle the stream of ingratiating flattery and calculated self-abasement, but he decided he would make better use of his apprentice. Cratch was the only one who had escaped this place the last time. That made him someone worth keeping around, and keeping close. The musky sense of fear rose from the throng ahead. A scratchy chorus of frightened voices drifted down the tunnel from some point ahead of Burnfang and the glow of his lanterns. Thankwell waited, his ears pricked to detect any sound of battle, one eye watching Cratch. After a moment, without hearing screams or the crash of steel, Thankwell decided that whatever had frightened the scouts wasn't fighting back. He motioned to his bodyguards and straightened his posture as he marched down the tunnel to take direct command of his minions and discover for himself what they had found. Stalking past Viscit Burnfang and his warlock engineers, Thankwell relieved the clan scryer leader of one of his lanterns, glaring at Burnfang, daring him to challenge the Grey Seer's confiscation of the apparatus. Instead of defiance, Burnfang sketched an insincere bow. Thankwell decided to ignore the insubordination, at least until a more opportune time. He discovered the source of Burnfang's smirking humour a moment later as he continued down the tunnel and the lantern was nearly pulled from his paw. Stumbling and tripping after him, dragged by the thick wires that connected the lantern to a bulky contrivance lashed across its back, was one of the warlock engineers, was being pulled along behind the Grey Seer. Thankwell scowled, glaring at the smirking clan scryer contingent, daring any of them to find humour in what was, after all, a slight oversight. Still dragging the warlock engineer and his battery after him, Thankwell found himself approaching a section of tunnel that broadened into a wide opening. Warriors from Clan Moors and Clan Scab stood around the opening, sniffing at the air, staring suspiciously at the walls. One side of the tunnel was choked by a mass of freshly collapsed earth, from which the stink of decaying Skaven rose. The smell was the same and even more potent ahead, however, but Thankwell hesitated to press past his warriors. It was only when one of the Clan Eshin gutter runners, the slivery scout supplied to the expedition by Scratch Scarpaw, crept back down to pass on reports to the Grey Seer, that Thankwell felt the imperative to advance.
"Tunnel burrow go into chamber cave ahead, Dreadmaster,"
the gutter runner wheezed, his breath as stagnant and foul as the linen rags he wore around his snout and across his face. Dyed black like the rest of the scout's ragged raiment, the Skaven was almost invisible in the gloom of the passage, only his distinct scent picking him out from the darkness.
"Chantor Puskub find snatch something,"
the scout added in a subdued whisper, nervously looking over his shoulder. Thanquol bristled at the words. Clan Pestilence, the diseased plague monks and their heretical perversion of the Horned Rat's religion. Too many times had those vile abominations stood between him and the glory that was his right. Nurglich probably knew full well what sort of artifact the Wormstone was, and had sent word ahead to Under Altdorf and his followers in the city to keep the device from Thanquol and the Council of 13.
"We'll see about this,"
Thanquol hissed through clenched fangs.
"Follow me,"
he snapped, pushing his storm vermin into the passageway ahead of him. He'd feel a bit more confident confronting the plague monks with the two albinos between him and the diseased curses of the Chantor. Noting that the clan rat warriors of Moors and Scab weren't displaying any initiative to join him, Thanquol scowled. He'd remember such faithlessness. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern. Instantly, Thanquol was impressed by the carrion stink. The glow from his warp lantern disturbed a swarm of starving vermin, gnawing at bones that still bore scraps of flesh. The rats chittered angrily, but refused to abandon their meal. Across the floor of the cave was a litter of other bones, much older bones, which converged into a great heap at the center of the chamber. Thanquol was quick to notice the way Cratch's attention instantly flashed to the heap and the sharp disappointment that flickered through his posture.
"Something wrong?"
Thanquol hissed in his most menacing whisper, low enough that only Cratch and the unfortunate warlock engineer he continued to drag behind him could hear.
"The Wormstone," Cratch whined. "It's gone, Master."
Thanquol's fangs ground together, his fur standing straight on his arms as he heard the adept speak. If his hands weren't filled with the staff and the warp lantern, he probably would have strangled the whining apprentice. What did he mean it was gone? Thanquol shuffled the staff into the crook of his arm and locked a paw about Cratch's throat anyway.
"What do you mean it's gone?" the Grey Seer demanded. "Are you telling me that I came all the way up here, to this miserable pit, to this human-reeking backwater, for nothing?"
Thanquol's clutch tightened. Cratch clawed feebly at the choking hand, even as he tried to gasp out apologetic protests.
"Am I supposed to go back to Skavenblight and tell the Seer Lord that the weapon he wanted is just gone?"
A feral fire burned in Thanquol's eyes now. Even the warlock engineer was spurting musk when the Grey Seer snarled at his apprentice.
"Gone, you slack-witted, turd-sniffing tick! How am I supposed to tell the Lords of Decay their weapon is gone?"
Cratch's eyes were starting to roll into the back of his skull, his tongue lolling from his jaws. Suddenly, Thanquol relented, letting the adept slump to the earth at his feet. The Grey Seer turned, remembering what the gutter runner had told him. There were others here more deserving of his wrath than the snivelling Cratch. There were several distinct groups of Skaven in the chamber, an old warren nest of the vanquished Clan Moor. Thanquol could see the clan scouts, a dishevelled gang of scrawny runts sniffing about the old collapsed exits to the cavern, poring about the rubble for any trace of plunder. He could see the Clan Moulder contingent, warriors in vivid yellow and blue cloaks, following the erratic movements of the Beastmaster and his warp bat as they prowled about the cavern. There were the Clan Eshin gutter runners, sinister in their blackened rags, doing their best to fade into the gloom of the cavern walls. Thanquol paid scant attention to any of these. His ire was directed against the last group occupying the chamber, the green-clad plague monks of Clan Pestilence and their crook-backed leader, Chantor Puscab. The plague monks were poring about the bones, picking through them with exaggerated care. Thanquol was not tricked by the pretended search. He knew Puscab had already found what he was looking for. Clan Pestilence had already swiped the wormstone.
"Looking for something?"
Thanquol challenged, his words slashing through the darkness. Every Skaven in the cavern turned when he heard the Grey Seer speak, hoping the fierce snarl wasn't directed at him. Chantor Puscab's first instinct was to cower, but the plague priest quickly composed himself. The green-clad ratman snuffled and coughed, spitting a blob of phlegm into the bone field.
"Look, seek," Puscab's dripping voice oozed. No, fine, yes.
The plague priest opened his paw, displaying for Thanquol's eyes something that looked like a fat green black worm. Before Puscab could explain the importance of what he had found, another voice echoed through the cave, sharp and shrill. The voice resounded from the walls. It was a frantic cry, sending a thrill of fear down the spine of every ratman who heard it.
Die, traitor meat!"
The gutter runners, who had so carefully maneuvered to positions in the shadows against the walls, now sprung from the darkness in a concentrated mass of violence and savagery. Thanquol saw green-clad plague monks dragged down beneath the stabbing, clawing bodies of the black-clad scouts, crushed against the floor until flashing daggers did their gruesome work. Only for an instant was Thanquol able to watch the havoc the gutter runners made of Puscab's minions. Even as the Grey Seer's heart swelled with the pride at the display of loyalty and appreciation for his leadership, he saw something leap towards him from the corner of his eye. A gutter runner, its fur showing black beneath its leather rags and linen wrappings, sprang towards him, a wicked-looking knife gripped in both its paws. Thanquol could smell the burning taint of poison rising from the blades. No mere gutter runner, the Skaven leaping for him was one of Clan Eshin's expert killers. The war cry, the attack on the plague monks, these were a distraction to cover the activities of an assassin. Thanquol's reaction was instant, instinctual. He spun about, diving away from the leaping killer. Still holding the warp lantern, Thanquol's dive was spoiled by the weight of the warlock engineer on the other end. Stumbling, struggling to maintain his balance, the warlock engineer toppled after the reeling Grey Seer. Thanquol heard the murderous snicker of the assassin as the black-cloaked Skaven struck at him with envenomed blade. Thanquol felt a heavy weight smash into him, crushing him into the ground. For an instant he thought the assassin's blow had landed, that some insidious Clan Eshin poison was even now pumping through his body. An agonized squeal in his ear, magnified by a mask of metal, told the Grey Seer what had happened. The warlock engineer, hurtling after Thanquol, had blundered into the path of the leaping assassin. Instead of striking the Grey Seer, the killer's blaze had stabbed into the body of the unfortunate engineer. Thanquol's fingers scurried into the folds of his grey robes, pulling a small piece of warpstone from her hidden pocket. Without hesitating to consider consequences, Thanquol popped the nugget beneath his fangs and bit down on it, grinding the little rock into powder with the frenzied actions of his teeth. Screams of battle raged all across the cavern. From the floor, Thanquol could see other assassins rushing to support the first killer. The albino storm vermin intercepted one of them, slashing at them with their halberds. The pouncing killer dived under the blade of one storm vermin, then leapt high over the blade of the second, slashing an ear from the bodyguard's head as he passed him. The injured storm vermin spun about to confront his attacker, but the assassin was already darting away. While the two bodyguards fretted over the one assassin, the second raced unimpeded towards his target. Blazing light swept through Thanquol's vision. banishing the less than magnificent display of his bodyguards as the power of the warpstone surged through his body. The Grey Seer felt the Warlock engineer's body being rolled off of him. The assassin had recovered one of his blades and was struggling to pull the second from the battery, lashed across the corpse's back. He turned his face to snarl at Thanquol, but his expression quickly changed as he saw the glow behind the Grey Seer's eyes. Like most of his kind, the assassin's glands had been removed so that his scent might not betray him. There was no musk of fear to tease Thanquol's nose, but the Grey Seer could see the mark of terror in his would-be murderer's eyes. If the power of the warpstone was not intoxicating enough, the fear of his foe was. Crackling yellow fire seared from the blazing head of Thanquol's staff as he pulled himself from the floor. The assassin's amazing reflexes allowed him to drop beneath the blast of arcane power with only a scorched cowl to speak of the nearness of his escape. In dodging the attack, however, the assassin was not prepared for a simultaneous strike. Swinging the warp lantern about with his other hand, Thanquol brought the heavy metal instrument cracking into this assassin's skull. The killer was thrown back, black blood and broken fangs spraying from the side of his mouth. Thanquol sneered at the stricken killer as he rolled through the dirt. The Grey Seer's sorcerously enhanced senses did not allow him to savour the wounding of his enemy, however. Even as the first assassin's body came to rest, Thanquol was turning away from him, turning upon the killer springing at him from behind. In mid-air, the assassin was unable to twist his body completely away from the crackling fire that Thanquol sent searing at him from the head of his staff. The magical fire bit through the Ratman's side like a red-hot sword, adding the reek of burnt entrails to the foulness of the cavern. The assassin flopped against the wall, his paws caked in his sizzling blood as he tried to push his belly back into his body. There was an adage among the Skaven. A dying enemy has the worst bite. It was a proverb that Thanquol had seen to be true far too many times. A dying enemy had nothing left to fear. Before the maimed assassin could make that realization, Thanquol sent a second bolt of arcane power blasting into his head, leaving only a dripping mass of charred gristle above his shoulders. To his credit, the third assassin showed an almost unscaven degree of determination and courage. Bolstered by some strange combat brew that increased his cunning and ferocity, the assassin used the gory demise of his brother as an opening to exploit. Eschewing the pouncing charge of his unfortunate comrade, the killer struck low, seeking to gut Thanquol with a wickedly curved short sword. The blade's serrated edge slashed through the Grey Seer's robe and shredded several scrolls tucked beneath Thanquol's belt. By only a breath did the poisoned metal miss the flesh beneath Thanquol's fur. The assassin twisted away, spinning his entire body around as though to retreat. Instead of running, however, he turned the motion into a reverse dive, thrusting his sword once more at his target. If the Grey Seer's senses were not aflame with the power of the warpstone, the assassin's attack would have been a blinding blur, like a flash of lightning, allowing no chance of escape. But Thanquol's body did pulse with that sorcerer's power, the corrupting foulness that only the Skaven were daring enough to draw into themselves. Everything around him seeming to move as though mired in the bogs of the blighted marshes. The assassin was like a rattling whelp, blind and naked, pathetic in its efforts to crawl upon its little pink nubs. Thanquol's sharpened mind had the leisure to consider a dozen ways to destroy this maggot, this faithless flea who had the temerity to dare to strike the mighty Grey Seer Thanquol. He bared his fangs in sadistic appreciation for what he would do to this filth. The blast of fire that lashed out from Thanquol's staff struck the assassin's arm, tearing it from his body at the shoulder, sending the severed limb dancing off in the gloom. The assassin shrieked and crumpled, then struggled to rise, the instinct to escape overcoming the agony of his mutilation. A second blast of crackling flame severed the Ratman's leg, spilling him back to the floor. Thankwell turned his back on the squirming wretch, leaving him to the vengeful blades of the storm vermin. It was the ultimate sign of contempt, ignoring the oldest of Skaven adages, the sort of recklessness that only the most powerful Skaven, or those lost in the grip of Warpstone, indulged in. Thankwell's eyes stared back towards the entrance of the chamber, looking for the first assassin. When he did not immediately see the black-clad killer, he brought the butt of his staff crashing against the floor in annoyance. A brilliant, blinding burst of light filled the cavern, washing out every shadow in a glowing haze. Only Thankwell, his eyes already aglow in the ecstasy of warp sight, was not stricken by the magical brilliance. He savoured the frightened squeals of the Skaven around him, giving little care to the fact that the terror was given voice by friend as well as foe. He was much too busy sneering at the figure revealed by the light, the slivery shape that had tried to creep up on the grey Seer to make another attack, slinking along on his belly. The first assassin had come within a foot of Thankwell before being struck blind by the grey Seer's sorcery. The assassin covered his eyes with one paw, hurling his dagger at Thankwell with the other. The spinning blade seemed to move in slow motion as it flew towards the grey Seer. The Thankwell contemptuously shifted away from its path, only dimly registering an agonized squeal rising from behind him. He had no time for other distractions. He had a killer to deal with first. The warp lantern came cracking down into the blinded assassin with the same brutality and strength as before. The Ratman was sent tumbling by the impact against his skull. Even as he rolled back down the entranceway, the assassin hurled his other dagger at Thankwell. The staff of the horned rat burned with power once more, sending a spectral green light to surround the flying blade. The weapon darkened with that light, withering with each instant. It splashed against the breast of Thankwell's robe, reduced to nothing more than a greasy smudge by the grey Seer's magic. "You would kill me?" Thankwell hissed, his voice booming with magical energy. Flickers of green light danced from his fangs as he spoke like fiery sparks from the mouth of a furnace. "Scat-licking frog nibbler! Curse, curse the moment you were plop-dripped from your breeder's belly!" The grey Seer unleashed a burst of power from his staff with each snarl, a burst of pummeling force that smashed into the assassin, throwing him yards at a time through the tunnels. Now the sorcerer's glow was gone. Thankwell's wrath and pursuit had been taking them back into the passageway. The warriors of Clan Moors and Scab, resolutely refusing to enter the cavern and take part in the violence they had heard, now hurried into the halls, horrified by the awful power the grey Seer was unleashing. "Grovel, beg, worm feeder," Thankwell growled at the battered assassin. The wretched ratmen bled from every corner of his body, limbs hanging from him in tangles, twistages of wreckage. It was all the creature could do to look at Thankwell, much less try to shape words to his broken mouth. It was not enough. The invigorating, fiery power of the Warpstone had magnified Thankwell's arcane power, enhanced his senses, swollen the speed of his devious mind, but one thing had shriveled beneath its influence: patience. Thankwell sent another burst of power smashing into the assassin, flinging his shattered wreckage into the mass of broken earth that marked the collapsed tomb of Scarbrit. The assassin's impart brought a burst of bloody froth from his muzzle, sent ribs skewering through his pelt. Thankwell favoured the watching clan warriors with a menacing smile, reminding them to pay particular attention to this example of the grey Seer's power, lest they be his next victims. Grey Seer Thankwell stalked towards the shattered assassin, his steps filled with power and malignity. However, even as his rage swelled, his might began to ebb. The warp sight faded slowly from his eyes. The fire slowly seeped out of his veins. For the first time, Thanquol felt the drag of the Warlock Engineer's body, causing him to drop the dented lantern he had been carrying. Strength deserted his excited muscles, and he was forced to lean on his staff for support. Thanquol's breathing became short, his heart pounding erratically against his chest. Panicked thoughts raced through his brain, urging him to consume another warpstone nugget before the power faded from him entirely. Thanquol shivered as he fought to keep his paw away from another hidden pocket, exerting all his willpower to keep the compulsion at bay. Addiction to warpstone was the curse of every Grey Seer if he was not prudent. An addiction that would end when the terrible powers of the warpstone became too much for any sorcerer to control, and the Grey Seer's body was ripped apart from within. A bloody smile came to the assassin's face as he saw Thanquol's power desert him. The Grey Seer simply scowled down at the killer, then crushed what was left of his face with his staff. After all, one did not need magic to settle with vermin.
"Let this be an example,"
Thanquol snarled as he turned away from the carcass. His gaze, even without the fire of warpstone behind it, was fierce enough to command the rapt attention of every Skaven in the passage. There were many more of them than there had been. Viscit, Burnfang, and the rest of his Warlock Engineers had come forward to join the warriors, while Cratch and several survivors from the treacherous attack in the cavern come back to see for themselves the outcome of Thanquol's fight.
"Smell see this,"
Thanquol ordered, pointing a talon at the bleeding ruin of the assassin.
"Remember, learn. This is what happens to all who betray Thanquol."
The Grey Seer fixed his fury on Cratch. The apprentice cringed at the attention, seeming to curl up in his own fur.
"Go!"
Thanquol growled, now pointing to the cavern.
"Someone has taken what I came here to find. Find it, before I think about all those who did not guard the safety of one who serves the council."
For emphasis, Thanquol fingered the talisman from the shattered tower. The reminder was enough. Clan rats, and Warlock Engineers, Clan School Scouts, and Clan Moulder Beast Handlers, an eager, frightened throng scurried up the passage and into the cavern, almost tripping over themselves in their haste to appease the Grey Seer's anger. Thanquol took a moment to enjoy the terror of his minions. The first rule of command for any Skaven was to ensure his followers feared nothing more than their leader. The ill-fated attempt on his life had gone far to instill that kind of respect in the ad hoc entourage he had been provided with by the Council of Under Altdorf. He would need that kind of power base now that the hunt for the Wormstone was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. That was something he would need to discuss with Cratch, preferably while tugging fangs from the lying maggot's mouth. As Thanquol followed after his underlings, the Grey Seer gave no notice to the body of the assassin he had killed. So it was with these eyes that he failed to see a slight trickle of earth drip from the collapsed heap of dirt and rubble, and his ears failed to hear a faint but persistent scratching sound rising from beyond the cave-in. Jacob Helmer stamped his feet against the splintered floorboards and clapped his hands together, trying to keep warm. The night chill that rose with the fog from the River Reich seeped through the shabby walls of the boarding house as though they weren't even there, soaking into the watchman's bones with a wintry clutch. Not for the first time, Jacob cursed his sergeant, his job, and the thin cloth of his tunic. What was so important about some room in a flytrap flophouse that Bayer wanted a man posted on guard all night? He suspected it was the sergeant's idea of a punishment duty after catching Jacob playing dice in the back room of the drunkard bastard the previous week. The suspicion, combined with the dampness of the fog and the chill of the night, might have been enough to convince him to abandon this thankless post for a few hours if Bayer's despicable penchant for checking up on his men wasn't still so fresh in the soldier's mind. If he was discharged from the watch, the best Jacob could expect from his wife was a cracked skull when she bounced a skillet off his head. The watchman blinked his eyes, staring into the creeping blackness that filled the stairway and the lower landing. He could only dimly make out the outline of the building's main door below, illuminated by the dim light of a streetlight outside. For an instant, it seemed to him that the outline had flickered, vanished for the briefest of moments. Jacob scowled and blew another hot breath against his hands. As cold as it had grown, even his eyes were starting to go numb. He nibbed his fingers together, watching as a little of the blue tinge faded from them. Perhaps he should pay a quick visit to the street of 100 taverns and secure something more substantial to fortify himself against the cold of the night. Jacob blinked as he looked up from his hands. The darkness of the stairwell seemed to have grown even more pronounced, thicker and blacker than it had been. He was just about to dismiss the impression as some trick of the light when a sound arrested his attention. The watchman spun about, his frozen hand dropping to his sword. He could not say what exactly the noise had been, but he was certain of where it had come from. Only a few feet away from him on the upper landing. The watchman felt his blood chill even more as his staring eyes picked out a figure among the shadows that filled the landing. Someone was standing there in the darkness, watching him. He could distinctly make out the silhouette of a tall man, shoulders and head just barely perceptible against the dark background. "Who's there?" Jacob challenged, his voice low and filled with threat. He allowed only a single breath to pass for an answer to come, then drew his sword. The rasp of metal against leather sounded loud as lightning in the silence of the hallway. The watchman took a step towards the dark figure in the shadows and repeated his challenge. Still, there was no reply. Licking his lips, Jacob raised his sword and took another step. If the stranger in the shadows thought to make sport of the watchman, he would soon discover that Jacob was in no mind to play games. The soldier took another step, his arm tense, ready to thrust 2 feet of sharpened steel into the body of the intruder. The last step brought a nervous laugh to Jacob's lips. As he drew closer, the sinister figure he thought he saw vanished. Another trick of his tired eyes. The shadow against which he had imagined he saw some lurking presence proved to be the outer wall of the house. There was nowhere any intruder could have escaped to, even if there had been one there. Jacob sheathed his sword and returned to his post, still chuckling over his fanciful fright. He looked back down the stairwell, smiling as he saw the outer door illuminated by the street lamp. Even the splotch of blackness he had been convinced lay upon the stairs was gone, another phantom of his fatigue and tedium. It never occurred to the watchman that he had seen something upon the stairway, something that wrapped itself in the blackness of the darkened building, something that had silently and swiftly raced up to the landing when Jacob turned to investigate the noise he had heard. He would not have believed that both the sound and the sinister silhouette were illusory suggestions that had been planted in his brain by an outside will. He did not know that, as he had been threatened by shadows. Something had come up behind him, stealthily opened the smashed door, and slipped inside the room he had been set to guard. Despite the pitch dark of the squalid room, the intruder picked his way with practiced ease, only the faint swish of a cloak betraying his presence. Eyes, fiery and piercing like ruddy garnets, penetrated the darkness, dissecting at a glance the place where Kleiner had spent his terrible ordeal. Carefully, the invader stalked towards the reeking pallet, like a panther on the prowl. A dark heap, indistinct and almost formless in the gloom, sprawled across the rag-strewn mess of soiled hay and greasy brown stains. The vile reek was familiar to the strange visitor, just as it had been to Theodore Bayer when he had made out his report. It was the same smell of death and corruption that had pervaded the carcass of the dog, but it was not the wreckage of a dog that dripped from the rags and hay. The few bones, the few scraps of flesh and organ that had not ruptured and corroded, told the observer that what he gazed upon had lately been a man. Gloved hands whispered in the darkness, reaching beneath heavy folds of grey cloth to produce two objects. The first was a small glass vial with a topper of cold wrought iron. The second was a thin copper device, like a knitting pin but hinged at its tip to form something resembling the bill of a gull. Holding the vial firmly in one hand, the intruder leaned above the pallet and prodded among the grisly ruin of what had once been the smuggler, Kleiner. After a few seconds of picking through the slimy mush, the hooked bill closed about something fat and elongated, almost resembling one of the dead man's fingers, but for its ghastly green-black colour and bloated, wormy shape. The grisly maggot hung lifelessly from the pincers as the intruder lifted it into the neck of the vial and quickly nudged it inside. The thing had never truly been alive, but there was a chance that its motive power had not yet been entirely spent. A chance that the man in the darkened room did not want to risk. He knew what manner of death had struck here, what terrible corruption had been passed onto the dog Theodore had killed. It was not that mystery that caused the visitor to linger in the squalid hovel, his penetrating gaze inspecting every nook and crack in walls and floor. He knew what kind of death stalked the streets of Altdorf. He did not know what he did not know was why it stalked, and how it had been brought into the city. Those questions remained a puzzle to the intruder when, just before the morning sun began to rise, he made his silent departure. There was no need to again ensorcel the senses of Jacob Helmer when he made his exit. The watchman had been asleep at his post for some hours when the intruder left. In that respect, Jacob was much like the city at large, asleep and unaware of the horror that threatened them all. It was as well that the city was unaware. Knowledge would bring panic, panic would bring confusion, and confusion would bring disorder. Altdorf could not afford such unrest, not when her enemies were so many and so near. Now that his master had examined what he had found, Theodore Bayer would be free to destroy the evidence of how Kleiner had died. The secret would be kept, and the ignorance of Altdorf's teeming masses would be maintained. For how long it could be maintained was a question for which the cloaked figure that vanished into the pre-dawn streets had no answer. Well, that was the end of chapter 5. I really hope you enjoyed that. Sorry for any kind of mistakes, and it'd be great to hear from you in the comments below on things you like, things you don't like, things you think I can do better, and things like that. But again, yeah, thank you so much for watching. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Goodbye.